I'm very honored today to have our friend, colleague, and a man that I respect so much. His name is Dr. Oba Tashaka. He has been teaching Africana Studies at San Francisco State for nearly 40 years. Prior to that and during that, and currently he's an activist. He was a part of the civil rights movement in San Francisco and actually led the civil rights movement in San Francisco. He's the author of 5 books that are phenomenal and important to read. And he also has been very supportive of our department and supporting the efforts that we do, trying to get you all interested in the Black experience and identifying strongly and then going to San Francisco State. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Oba Tashaka.
How's everybody doing? I figured that today I wasn't going to just give a speech. I wanted to get some things from you and then have some things to share with you. What I wanted to talk about today is African American culture, which I call New African culture. You'll see why in a minute. And this is dealing with the culture that was developed here. But I had some questions that I wanted to ask you all first. Just by a raise of hands, how many people think that slavery basically destroyed African culture in the United States? Raise your hand. How many do not? Raise your hand. Now, tell me, why do you think that slavery destroyed African culture in the United States?
Yes. Slavery made sure that it implemented and separated the African culture from the African who was enslaved and brought over to the United States. You know, now we can reclaim that culture back, but it was very successful at destroying our culture. So.
I feel that it destroyed our culture because I can't look at another brother and know that he's my keeper. I can't make sure to know that he's going to come and greet me in the same respect that I'm going to greet him. My life could be on the line from his lack of understanding or from his sensitivity. So I feel that it really turned us against each other, and now we look at each other more as targets or animals, not even as really human beings and keepers.
Now that answer there would, to the extent that it's true, and that would be another question, is that true for all Black people or even most? That question there, you might have to separate that one into how much of this mistrust and how much of the problems we have today are due to things that have happened recently, like since 1968, since a lot of things have hit our community, and how much of that has to do with something that happened before. Because this generation sitting in here, with the exception of people in my age group, that's your experience. That doesn't necessarily have to do with slavery per se. Slavery may have contributed to it, but not necessarily so. So one answer is that our culture was destroyed because we were separated, our culture was separated from us, and by implication, I'm drawing from your answer that Africans were separated from each other, because that's a common assumption, that Africans of the same ethnic group were separated, couldn't communicate with each other. And that was part of the way in which the enslavement process wiped your culture out. Any others? I saw there was hardly no answers for its survival.
The reason why I think that it got rid of the African culture is because another part of slavery made us glorify white traditions and culture. And when we glorify something else, we want to not just forget our own, but we end up hating our history or who we are. So it's self-hatred. It has everything to do with the loss of language, tradition, culture. It was intentional in order to survive.
Okay, so another answer is that slavery destroyed our culture. It created a system of self-hatred, identification with white culture. It turned us against ourselves.
I believe that word is acculturated.
We got acculturated to a white culture, let's say. Anyone else? Yes.
I think that they took our, I mean, basically, I don't think we do anything that has anything to do with our people. Like, I noticed, like, Asians, they got rice and Chinatown and certain things that they claim is their own, not to be funny, but I don't know anything that us as blacks that come from our culture that we do right now, like, besides braids, like, it's not, I don't see anything that I say or do that's not from here. Like my grandma passed it down, like most of the things I learned, it's stemmed from slavery, like the eating habits and disciplinary, just all of that stuff. None of it to me came from Africa, like that I could pinpoint.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
They took away our identity.
Anybody else? That's what I thought you said. So how could it be that I'm in here talking about African American culture if our culture was destroyed during slavery, right? First, the truth and what was said. The formal language of Africa was destroyed. Formal language. That doesn't mean that something new that was African-based may not have happened, but the formal language was destroyed. And in this country, the formal practice of African religion, which there's no word in African languages for religion, that's a European word. It means to mix paganism with Christianity, this idea of religion. That's a religio. That comes from the Romans. Africans had no idea of that, because for the most part, with the exception of Ethiopians, we weren't Christians. We didn't buy into that. And we wouldn't certainly consider ourselves pagans. We practiced spirit beliefs. So formal African religion, except for a few places like Louisiana, did not remain strong, but that does not mean that an African-based religion was not recreated. Okay? Polygamy as a system where a man could have more than one wife was outlawed, but still practiced undercover, but not the formal institution, and not practiced to the degree that it's practiced in the Caribbean or South America, where you will see polygamy, even though the man, let's say in the Caribbean, may have 5 women that he calls his wives. 4 of them are outside wives, outside families. So Christianity has led the culture to frown on it, but it's still practiced. Polygamy is still practiced. And the reason is blacks were the overwhelming majority on the plantation, so that formal institution would be practiced. And in the case of Haiti, Cuba, Brazil, formal African religion, often, sometimes more African than the African religion, because it got mixed together sometimes with Indian religion in the case of Haiti, and it became the basis for the only successful revolt against slavery in history, African religion. Voodoo, as you call it, which is not what you think it is. It's just simply referring to God. So these things are true, that these formal vestiges of African culture were attacked. Chieftainship, you couldn't maintain chieftainship here if the white boys controlling the plantation, but there were always leaders on plantations. So chieftainship could not be maintained. But African culture is a lot more than that. Here's assumptions that are made that are incorrect. The assumption that was just made that Africans were separated from each other and therefore could not talk to each other. There's an excellent book that's come out called Exchanging Country Marks. It's written by a guy named Michael Gomez. He's African, I think from Caribbean. And other authors. I've written a recent book called Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. And what both of us and other scholars show is this. It is false to assume that Africans were separated ethnically or tribally. Why? because the data clearly shows that there were concentrations of Africa in Georgia, in Louisiana, in South Carolina, in Mississippi that came from specific African regions. Why? Because the enslaver needed their skills. So in the case of South Carolina, for example, the rice crop, they needed people from the Senegambian region of West Africa to grow rice. That's a high agricultural skill. Whites did not know how to do that. And so when you eat rice, you're eating an African food that is introduced from Africa. So you may not know it. All that stuff that you like, those greens, those yams, all that stuff, that's African diet. Y'all understand that? You just don't know it. So the point is, Africans were able to communicate with each other. And the data clearly shows up until the 1830s, most Africans in the United States could not hardly speak English. Not because they couldn't, because Africans on the continent spoke many languages. It's common in Africa to speak 4 or 5 languages. We the most, that is the United States of America, are the most ignorant when it comes to language. We don't even know how to speak English very well, which isn't a bad thing. But you need to know it to get out of college. That's a joke. It's not such a bad thing. The reason that most Africans up through 1830 didn't speak English, it was cultural resistance, because they understood the white man's language imposed his worldview. They resisted it. But when the language changed, what happened is you have what you call ebonics. I mean, if we listen to hip-hop comes up with his own language. The word hip, do you know where hip comes from? So you think you have nothing to relate to this African. There's a whole lot that is, but you know where the word hip comes from. Anybody know? It's a Wolof word. It means hippie cat. Hippie means to see from all sides. Is it an accident that the youth picked up hip hop? No, it's not. It means to be cool as opposed to being square. Y'all know what I mean? Y'all know what I mean, don't you? That's my generation term, but you know what I mean? Knowing how to move your hips, you know what I mean? Knowing how to be cool, you know what I mean? Hip. Now here's an aside. I'm going to keep going through this. Here's an aside. If we lost our culture, why is it that Native Americans, not so much, because they have, it's one of the 2 cultures indigenous to this country, but Asian Americans, Latino Americans, white Americans are imitating your culture. If you don't have a culture, you explain that one to me. And then you also have to explain to me what is the basis of the thing you call hip hop. And I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to get back to that because it'd be the same old thing. So the first thing is we were able to communicate with each other. You understand? And we communicated with each other for hundreds of years. That's the first thing. And in the process of that, we were in the process of reformulating a culture. Now you say, one of the things that changed over time was we came in here as Wolof, Yoruba, Asante, Dogon. My people come from Madagascar. Most people don't know where their people come from. My great-great aunt, who lived to be about 109, kept this in her diary. And then on my father's side as well, on my grandmother's side as well, Madagascar. That's a small island off of Tanzania, East Africa. No more than a few thousand Africans came from Madagascar. But the point is that we came with ethnic identification, tribal identification. But over time, that changed. Because on the slave ship, we saw this. You caught hell for one reason. What was that? Huh? No. What was the reason? No, we caught hell. We were enslaved for one reason. Why? You black. And over time, beginning on the slave ships, Africans began, who were Wolof, Yoruba, Asante, they began to see color of the skin. Color of the skin. Over time, that becomes like a part of the new African culture. See, what I'm asserting here is, we, in the enslavement process, they tried to wipe our culture out, and a more thorough attack was made on our culture here than any other part of the Western Hemisphere because the whites outnumbered us here. But in the South, we often had the numbers. South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia. That's why Denmark Vesey's rebellion came within a hair of success. How many people have heard of Denmark Vesey? He led the best organized slave revolt in history. And he had as his chief lieutenant Gula Jack, who was an Angola voodoo man, priest. I'm in the Yoruba spirit system. And I tell you, this is no joke. These systems are no joke. And as a result, this voodoo priest was so good that he was able to spook out the South Carolina governor's house Negroes who were like trained pets. You know what I mean? Who would bark when the master said bark and bite when the master said bite. But when Gula Jack got through with them and put that hoodoo on them, that doo-doo, y'all know what that stuff is about? When he got through, they were ready to poison the master. Y'all get this? So the point is this. Over time, a new African culture was formulated based on African principles primarily. But it had to be recreated in this environment because of the way in which the culture was attacked. And so what was one of the first cornerstones of it? It was this idea of race consciousness. This idea that it don't matter what group you come from, and by the third generation we didn't remember, most of us, you black. You hear me? You black. And this thing of race consciousness has to be distinguished from racism because African culture is humanistic. Africans do not put people down based on the color of their skin. African Americans largely do not either. We tend to be humanistic, though sometimes we don't practice as much humanism towards each other as we do towards others. Am I telling the truth here? Witness the number of us that are getting blown away every day. It looks like we're in a race to kill each other. You know what I mean? That's another phenomenon. But the point is that race consciousness became a part of this new African culture. It became the basis for it. Now, in terms of language, I want to bounce back to this language thing. Even though we no longer speak Yoruba, Asante, Dogon, whatever, I'm not a specialist on African American linguistics, but there's a whole thing on African American language. And what's clear about African American language is it's based on an African structure. And that African structure, for example, in African American language, the verb often comes before the noun. It's a verbal sentence. That is based on the fact that in African languages, things are active. So you're always describing something. So in an African American language, old people would talk about a sitting chair as opposed to a chair because it's what you squat on. You understand? Or, we would take a noun and we would turn it into a verbal noun. Instead of going to a funeral, we're going to funeralize him. Y'all heard those kind of terms before? You understand? That's an African mindset. But here's the key point. If you go to the southern United States, my folks on one side come from Mississippi, the other side they come from Texas, but Orange, Texas, right on the border of Texas and Louisiana. And I know y'all know what parts of the South y'all come from. But that language that is spoken in the South, that happened to be based on an African language. You understand? Because in the vowel structure of, say, Swahili, the vowel A-E-I-O-U is A-E-O-U. So when you hear somebody say y'all, that'd be an African syntax. Y'all get it? And you all do that today in your revised form. Am I telling the truth? Yes. So when you see whites running around here, Ku Klux Klansmen saying that Barack Obama needs to produce his birth certificate, but he'd be doing it with his southern drawl. And when you go to the South, you will find that whites are very hospitable towards each other. White people have generally not been hospitable. But that hospitality comes from African culture because we are about being humane and sharing. White people in the South, not all whites, but too many will share a rope with you around your neck. You know what I mean? But when it comes to being nice towards each other, they pick that niceness up from us. You understand? So the language got changed, but it has an African base to it. And this is my point. African American culture is a new African culture. That is, it had to be reformulated because of the attacks on it. But because for centuries, these were African people who even continued to speak their own African language, and believe it or not, for centuries, Africans loved Africa. But we had drummed in our head this idea, a savage in Africa, a slave in America. And it took root with some of us. It definitely took root with the remote control, automatic pilot, 00 soul Negro who we have right now. Y'all know what I'm talking about? The one who says, I don't want to have nothing to do with Africa. I didn't lose anything. You ever heard that talk? Yes. Who will call blacks from the continent sand, you know what? And that whole N-word, which I ain't using in here because I know the hip-hop generation, there's a debate. Some say it's good, some say it's bad, some say if you put the A-H on the end of it, it's affectionate. Well, guess what? That N-word was designed to negate your existence. You don't hear no Chinese running around here with no derogatory term like that towards themselves. You don't hear Mexicans who are themselves mixed race. Spanish, Indian, African. That's what a Mexican is. You don't hear them running around here doing that. That's a part of that negative part of your slave legacy. And I'll say this, if you conceive that person next to you as a valuable, creative human being, as an African or an African American or a black person, it's less likely you're going to blow them away. You know what I mean? So this N-word, that ain't no love. Don't be telling me it's love. But the point is that in the enslavement process, the language was changed. You know, we come up with a culture that is African-based, but it's New African because it had to be reformulated here. So here's the point. This is the problem. When you say, I don't recognize anything in this culture that's African, the question is, do you know what is African? That's a real question. Because very often, you know, when we say this culture is not African-based, we're not clear on exactly what it is to be African, other than the label. You know what I mean? Other than the formal things, the clothes you wear, or something else. Africanity, as is true of Asian thought, Native American thought, or any other thought, is based on your mindset. It's based on your worldview. So let's take another one. It's commonly believed that Christianity destroyed African culture in the United States because, you know, black people be Christians now, those that are. Hip-hop generation got the largest unchurched generation of any generation of black folks. Y'all know that? Did y'all know that? Yes. A lot of the young ladies who raise their children may not be in the church, but they're sticking their children in the church. Did y'all know that? Mm-hmm. But a lot are. A lot still are in the church. But here's the point about Christianity. The assumption is that slavery destroyed our identity because we became Christians. According to W.B. Du Bois, how many of you have heard of W.B. Du Bois? See, I'm citing facts here. He's the greatest scholar produced in this country, bar none. You understand? Bar none. According to W.B. Du Bois, in 1859, out of a population of 8.5 million Africans in the United States, only 459,000 were Christian. 1859. Y'all hear what I'm saying? So what does that mean? That means for nearly 300 years, Africans were practicing something else. What was that something else they were practicing? Some were Muslims. They were a minority, but some were Muslims. What were they practicing? I'm asking you. What you call voodoo? Huh? Spirit practices. W.B. Du Bois made this observation. He said the natural leader of the African in the United States was the Obeah man. O-B-E-A-H. O-B-E-A-H. That term is found all over the Caribbean and South America. The Obeah man was an African priest. He, you know, he was called a conjurer or a diviner. In African spirit systems, the priests divine, and they tell you about your future. My priest does that for me, and I can tell you it's very accurate. Very, very accurate. But on every plantation, you had 1, 2, or 3 of them. They were often men, but sometimes women. They were feared, and they were respected. As Du Bois said, they were the comforter of the sick and the healers as well, and they were those who protected the race. They were the natural leaders. And if you had a slave rebellion, you needed to have a African priest as a part of it. So here's the deal. For nearly 300 years, we were practicing something else. Only a handful of blacks were really into Christianity. Most of them were house slaves. House slaves. Some, as Malcolm X said, loved the master more than the master loved himself. But those field blacks, they had a different attitude. As Malcolm said, when the master's house was burning down, they prayed for a wind. You hear me? Huh? And very often they set the fire. And they were the ones who would rebel against the master. But not all house slaves loved the master. A lot of house slaves, their families were in the field. They got whipped in the house because they were often raped by the master. They had children by the master, and so Miss Ann didn't like it. And so Miss Ann wreaked hell on the house slaves. So many house slaves did side with those in the field. But many also betrayed blacks because they were the first to take on a white mentality. But they were a minority. You understand? So over time, blacks have to protect their culture. Because what do you think is the most important thing in African culture? Well, let me put it this way. Among black people in this country, of all the things that we associate with, what's the most important thing as a group for us? What? Yes, family. But what comes before family? God. Somebody said money. Because it's God. God. God in our culture comes first, family second. I mean, it's in our nervous system. I mean, if you see a brother who's playing basketball, he slam dunks and wins the game, he says 2 things. What's the first thing? What's the second thing? Yeah, that's his priority. See, whatever you call on in a moment of joy or sorrow is what you really believe in. So you see, for African people, God is primary. But in African culture, God isn't approached directly. God's approached through spirit. Various kinds of spirits. And so on the plantation, what ended up happening was this. African people maintained their connection to spirit. My mother, who died 6 years ago, she wasn't a church-going person, but she was a praying person. She said she would communicate with God in the evening. Because my mother liked to sleep 12, 13 hours. Because she worked hard. She ran a preschool. Worked 14, 15 hours a day, up to about 88 years of age. But that is common with black folks. So when there was an attempt to destroy our religion, what did we do? We preserved it. How? Through hush harbors. Who's heard of hush harbors? You know what it was?
When they got together in the woods together.
Right.
And communicated either through their original language, but they spoke. You didn't know what knew about it.
Hush harbor, yes. Oh, she said it was hush harbor was a thing where people got in the woods and communicated, sometimes in their own language, sometimes in the language we speak now, and worship. Hush harbors, that was it. They could be a swamp, it could be a forest, it could be the furthest removed cabin on the plantation, but it was away from the master's eyes and his ears. And this was, my wife is from Barbados. They had the same thing in Barbados, which surprised me because they were the overwhelming majority in Barbados. So why would they need hush harbors? But the point is, I know why now. What Africans would do is go into these secluded places and put their head under a bucket. And their head would be under a bucket and they'd be calling on the Spirit. And only when they experienced the Spirit, which in the sanctified and Baptist and Holiness Church you call what? The Holy Ghost. And what do you think that is for African people? That's the spirit that is the basis of the heart of your culture. And what did they say about this? They said, by drawing on the spirit, it enabled us to continue for another week. Why do most black people go to church? So that they can draw on the spirit so it will carry them through to the next week. Am I telling the truth? Huh? So what you got to understand is this. You may call yourself a Christian. Many of you call yourselves Christians. But the fact is, your Christianity is different from white Christianity. It isn't just different in how the preacher preaches, which is a whole other part of the thing. But it is different because Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are the only religions in the world where God is external to what he creates. God creates outside of himself. In so many days, he creates everything. But in African, Asian, Native American spirit systems, we are of God. We are of God, meaning this thing, this embryo that forms in the womb, this seed of life is sacred. Human beings are sacred. And in African belief, you don't come in here with no original sin. Because what did you do to warrant the original sin? If you don't believe in past lives, you did nothing. You're of a divine origin. But the key point is this. Spirit is the heart of new African culture. Europeans will argue this, and they have a point. Christianity's been an opiate of the masses. This was Karl Marx's statement. Marx, how many people heard of Karl Marx? Yeah, he formulated a doctrine called Marxism, that the wealth should be equally distributed and so forth and so on. And what he argued was Christianity was like dope. It just kind of wired people up and got them to escape. And to some extent in the Western world, there's an argument for that. Because the person who adopts Christianity in the West is an emperor named Constantine. He has a dream and he sees himself leading an army, and there's a cross in front of him. So he embraces Christianity. But he doesn't become a Christian until his deathbed, because he wanted to be forgiven for all his sins. And so he boiled his wife in hot water. He killed her baby, killed his best son because he was jealous of him. This guy was a savage, but he called himself a Christian. And much of what you believe, if you talk about formal Christian doctrine, comes from a lot of stuff was established under him, right? But the point is, Africans and Africans in America believe that God is within us. Am I telling the truth about that? Let's get down to where the rubber hits the road. Martin Luther King, when he's leading the Montgomery bus boycott, he didn't choose to lead it. The people picked him. That's the best kind of leader. Because he's not looking for power, not looking for glory. And he had doubts. And one night he's sitting in his kitchen. And he's doubting, should he go on? And he had fear, as he should. Because, you know, even today, but especially then in the South, you could get iced, killed, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You leading the movement, you are likely to face death. So he said, in the midst of sitting in that room, the Spirit, God, the Spirit possessed him and told him, Martin, don't go back and don't have fear anymore. And King said he no longer had fear. And before every demonstration, he would say, we should look at each other because we might not see each other again. But Spirit is what guided him. I led the San Francisco Civil Rights Movement. I spent some time in Mississippi. Not a lot, but some time in Mississippi. That was the hardest place to organize because whites were the most vicious. My grandmother and great-grandmother came from Mississippi. She told me how this is after slavery. They would bury black people up to their necks and put honey on their face and let the ants eat them alive. This is after slavery. Yet in Mississippi, black women and black men, handfuls of them, decided to lead a movement when it was almost certain that they would die, uncertain that they would be successful. And what were the reasons they gave? 2 reasons. The Spirit spoke to me because the churches didn't support it. The churches were afraid. They said, the Spirit spoke to me, and or it was my daughter or my wife or my husband or my brother that encouraged me. It was either spirit or family. Sine qua non of new African culture. Why? Because the heart and soul of African culture is spirit first, family second. Y'all get this? But when it comes to family, we could not maintain polygamy. Though some brothers would like to try. In fact, when brothers want to become African, that's one of the first things they want to talk about, is getting them a whole lot of wives. You know what I mean? And I can understand why, because woman is the finest thing that God created, and because I'm black, I think the black woman is the finest thing that God ever created. Whereas there's a saying that dog is man's best friend, woman is man's best friend. And the black woman is the black man's best friend, whether he realizes it or not. And the proof of it is, if your mama didn't put all she's put into you, we wouldn't be here. Am I telling the truth? Huh? We all have to thank our mamas. And no mama's perfect. You know what I mean? So we can get past that. And the fact is, when brothers usually end up marrying, they will end up finding out, if they didn't know it already, that after they get married, they married somebody like their mama. Am I telling the truth? Now here's the deal. We couldn't maintain formal polygamy. So what did we recreate in its place? Can anybody tell me? What was recreated in its place?
Cheating.
Oh, cheating. Oh, we're going to get into that. Yes, there's a lot of that going on.
Was it wartime polygamy? When the men would die in war, the remaining men coming back would have multiple wives? That would have replaced it just during the time of war?
Well, here polygamy wasn't maintained. And the reason for polygamy in Africa was, this is the reason. The reason was, women, when they gave birth, women required that they have 3 to 4 years of not having a child again. That meant there'd be no sex. Now the reason was, the woman reasoned that just as the land had to not be overworked, the woman should not be overworked. And she should have 3 or 4 years to tend to that child before she had another child. Now, it's going to be one disciplined African man that's going to be able to go without sex for 3 to 4 years. Y'all get it? That was the main reason. And women, because you were an agricultural society and you needed large families to bring the crop in, you needed as many children as possible. So the first wife would pick the second wife, and often the husband's family was involved in it too. But the point is, that wasn't continued here. What was recreated here was extended families. And how did it work to begin with? It worked if you were brought in off a slave ship onto a plantation, you were adopted often into somebody's family. They would have a thing called the rinshot. It was a counterclockwise dance that enslaved Africans did, and it was a way of integrating the young with the old. And so people who had no blood relationships were fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers, aunts, and uncles. Extended family community has been the thing that has sustained us through the mid-'80s. And what has weakened the extended family community? Y'all should know. What happened? Drugs. When drugs hit the black community, then it drives a wedge between the young and the old. And you've got a lot of older people who are now, because when I was coming up, you do something wrong, any elder in the black community is going to come upside your head for it. And then walk you home and tell your mama. In fact, when I was a little kid, I was raised in the Fillmore, and I busted an old woman's window. She slapped me upside my head, brought me home, and my mother always had a way of administering heavy manners, as the British call it. Heavy manners. You know where that gets administered. Now, some of that's a carryover of slavery, too. You know what I mean? If it gets carried too far. But the fact is, it kept a whole lot of us in line. So extended family communities became the basis for continuing this culture. I can go on and on and on. I'm simply going to say this. If you look at hip-hop, what's the base of hip-hop? When you're dealing with what is hip hop based on? What are the basic things that build hip hop?
The struggles of an African-American male or woman.
That's key, and especially in the beginning. Kool Herc, he comes from Jamaica. Kool Herc adapts his stuff to the United States, but the Jamaicans have their whole issues to deal with because they have some serious oppression that they're facing there. You know what I mean? And then if you're dealing with Public Enemy and any of the rest of them, they have got a message that they're concerned about. What else is hip hop based on? Saw a hand back here? Yes.
It's fellowship. It has beat, drugs. So it's about community getting together.
Rhythm. Rhythm, and as you say, fellowship, it's family. Yes.
Oh, no, I was gonna say like a voice for people that can't speak, that don't know how to explain what they're going through. That's just another voice outlet.
Right, and a key element of this voice is the word, the funky word, hip hop. But if you look at the blues, what's the key thing about the blues? It's the word. You understand? If you look at gospel music is nothing but the word of the preacher put to music. It's the word. African culture, while we gave birth to writing, the spoken word is primary. And so therefore, when we write, we often write the way we speak. So in ancient Egypt, they described the language, medu neter, as the walking, talking, doing word. And so if you hear a sanctified preacher preach, he's preaching the same way that these people in ancient Kemet did their thing. He's not only walking and talking, he's dancing and shouting. You hear me? Sanctified church. How many people heard of the sanctified church? Sanctified church is the church that was created by blacks in what's called Christianity, but is the most African part of it. And it was a brother in Los Angeles who started the sanctified church, and what would he do? He'd put a pot over his head and run through the community. That was the hush harp. And what I failed to mention before is the pots that black people put their heads under. The reason they said was so that they could muffle the sound, but you can't muffle the sound in a pot. Put your head under a pot and make some noise. People are going to hear you. But in Africa, the pot, there were sacred pots that contained spirits. This was a continuation of African spirit practices. So hip-hop is an extension of new African culture. It is the youth version of it. In fact, what I call hip-hop is the youth urban blues. And the blues is not all sad. You hear me? Blues cuts both ways. And the blues is the basis, the spirituals are the blues. It's the basis of this musical culture, but it is also the basis of the thought culture of Africans in this country. We don't see things as good or bad. We see things in everything bad is good, and in everything good is bad. You understand? Africans have a saying, life is slow dying, death is a rebirth to a new life. We see things cutting both ways. So let me summarize this thing. You need to read my book, Integration Trap, Generation Gap, Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. I didn't bring any because you students don't buy books. I ain't even wasted my time carrying one. He's got one back there. I correct myself on that one. But by and large, that's the case. Y'all is programmed to read what you have to read. You don't get any more. Now, some of you do read. And I'm going to tell you, education is self-education. It's not just what you get in the classroom. So let me just say this before you leave, because this is the most important part. I want to summarize this. Therefore, our culture is a new African culture because it is based on African principles but reformulated in this environment. I have only given a few examples. 1. 2, it is the culture along with Native Americans. Listen to this one. That is indigenous to the United States. It was born here. We didn't just, had we been able to do as the Europeans have done and bring Europe here, then it would just be an African culture, which would be great. But the fact is it had to be reborn here, so it's rooted here. Native American culture and New African culture are the two cultures that spring from this soil. You hear me? Listen to this one. This culture is the culture of popular choice in this country. Every generation, if you check out the generations,
you will find that while many different ethnic groups may not like black people, they like black culture. Am I telling the truth? Some of them are getting rich off of it. You hear me? And very often the people who own and control the means of putting your stuff out there, they definitely don't like you. Witness the people who are putting out this horrid stuff that they call corporate hip-hop. The bling bling, B-bomber, all the rest of this stuff. You know what I'm talking about? Huh? That ain't hip-hop. That's a distortion of it. But it is the culture of popular choice. In the movement of the 60s, the culture of popular choice was the culture of rhythm and blues. It was the culture of the civil rights movement. It was the culture of black power. It was the culture of the Black Panthers. And what did every other group do? They followed that. You had brown berets imitating the Black Panther Party. You know, Puerto Ricans, young lords imitating the Black Panther Party. Don't get me wrong. Every one of these cultures have their own culture. So when Asians take on hip hop, they put their own message in there. And that's the key thing about our culture is it frees people up to be themselves. Next point about this culture is it's the culture that counters the culture of oppression. You all say you don't have a culture, but just as my generation could mark its existence by the death of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, your generation marks it by the deaths of who? Tupac and Biggie. And in the case of Tupac, he had a real message of liberation. And Biggie, he was talking real stuff. He was talking stuff like, it used to be that our parents raised us. Now our parents are afraid of us. What's up? You understand? Huh? He's talking real. But the point is this. This culture counters the culture of European oppression. European oppression. Not just at the musical level, at the political level, at the social level. I don't care what level you're talking about. And let me just say this. This culture is organic. Because it is rooted here, it changes according to generations, but the next generation that comes, there will be a generation beyond hip-hop. Y'all know that. Because it's played its course almost. And they're going to draw from the same principles. And what I'd say about the hip-hop generation, the conscious hip-hop generation, is they made an improvement on the culture. My generation called creativity creating, improvising. You all call it what? Freestyling. Freestyling is a better expression of it because it's telling you the essence of how we create is about creating something beautiful so we can be free. So I just want to end on this note. You're a lot better than you think. You need to appreciate the culture you have.
That's right.
Because right now, this culture is eroding. This death mess that we're in, the reason we're in trouble now is some of us are consciously choosing to abandon our culture. You hear me? Consciously. When you have people, I understand some of the murders that are occurring around the country are gang-related. I understand some of them are revenge-related. I understand all of that. A lot of them drug-related. But some of them have got to do with something demonic beyond that. One brother made a comment recently. He said, I would rather go to jail for killing somebody than to live my life for nothing. Can you hear that? In other words, the worst thing you could possibly be would be better than being who you are. Guess what? You're not nothing. You're a great people. Guess what? Everybody was put here with gifts, and it's a question of how you pursue them. And so in our case, we got to recognize what we got right under our nose. This beautiful thing, which is our way of life, our design for living, our mothers, in many cases you may not know them, but our fathers, our people, our history. Thank you.
Thank you.